Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on top 5 rare French weapons that could have been useful during the Battle of France and the Battle of Belgium in 1940, and also the Battle of Norway in 1940. During the summer of 1940, or the early part of 1940, the Germans had basically blitzkrieged most of France's other allies, with the exception of Norway and Belgium, who were pretty much the last barrier between Germany and France. Keep in mind, there was also a second border between Germany and France, where the Germans and the French were pretty much facing each other. And at one point in September 1939, the French actually did invade Germany during the Saar offensive, but that offensive was eventually abandoned after the fall of Poland in the same month of September 1939. But here are some of the rare weapons that the French needed during the battles of Norway, Belgium, and eventually the German invasion of France. Now, the French army was actually pretty advanced, even when compared to their British counterparts, but they were still lacking in some key areas, just like their British counterparts and their Belgian and Norwegian counterparts. So here are 5 rare infantry support weapons, or infantry weapons, that were needed by the French military, or that were in production, or in some cases could have been in production, but were ultimately abandoned, and these weapons were badly needed by the French military in 1940. And the first weapon on the list is number 5, the Henri Delac submachine gun from 1935. Now, Henri Delac was a forgotten French arms designer. In the 1930s, he had also designed a bullpup pistol carbine for the French military. But during the same year, in 1935, he had also designed a submachine gun known as the Henri Delac M1935. And this was a cheap, ergonomic prototype submachine gun from 1935. It was chambered in either the 9x23mm Steyr, or in some cases the 9x19mm Parabellum. There were multiple prototypes built, and this weapon was fed by a 50-round drum magazine. This weapon also had a rate of fire of about 600 to 650 rounds per minute, and this weapon was basically like the French version of the Soviet PPSH-41 or the PPS-43 submachine gun. Easy to mass produce submachine guns. If you know your Soviet submachine guns, you know that the Soviets produced easy to produce submachine guns like the PPS-H-41, the PPS-42, and the PPS-43 submachine guns. And this Henri Delac M1935 submachine gun was basically like the French version of those weapons, but in the mid-1930s. And this weapon could have been useful if the French had taken it seriously. At the time period in the mid-1930s, the French actually didn't believe that they would ever go to war with Germany again after the First World War. They knew a conflict could happen, but they didn't think it would be on the scale of the Second World War. So the French didn't have 20/20 hindsight, so there was no real reason at the time for them to adopt this weapon, but it could have been a useful submachine gun, as the French military also lacked submachine guns during the first years of World War II, just like their British, Belgian, and Danish counterparts, Danish and Norwegian counterparts during the early part of the war in Europe. Now imagine if the French did have this weapon mass produced as a cheap and simple submachine gun concept. They could have at least held their ground during the German ground invasion, both in Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and France. But ultimately, this never happened, and this weapon was never mass produced, so that's basically it for this rare weapon. The Henri Delac M1935, a rare French submachine gun that could have been useful in 1940 during the fall of France and the Low Countries. Now, keep in mind, during the later part of the 1930s, the French actually did take submachine guns seriously to an extent enough to adopt at least one submachine gun, and that was the MAS-38. Now, the MAS 38 was chambered in the 7.65 by 20 millimeter cartridge and was fed by a 32 round magazine and had a rate of fire of 600 rounds per minute. But unfortunately, this weapon came into service way too late. It came into mass production in mid to late 1938, and by that point, the Germans had already mass produced enough of their own submachine guns, like the MP-38, later renamed the MP-40. And by World War II, by the time war actually broke out, the French had produced less than 2,000 MAS 38 submachine guns. But keep in mind, the French actually had another submachine gun, another MAS submachine gun that came into service over a decade before the MAS 38. And this submachine gun is the number 4 gun that could have been useful in 1940 during the Battle of France. And that gun is the STA Model 1922, also known as the MAS 1924 or the MAS 24 submachine gun. Now, this weapon was actually based on the German MP-18. After World War I, the French had gotten their hands on a bunch of captured German MP-18 submachine guns, and following the armistice in November, and in 1919, the French got to work reverse engineering the MP-18 into this weapon, the STA Model 1922, which was later renamed the MAS M1924 in 1922. Now, this weapon was chambered for the 9 by 19 millimeter Parabellum, the same cartridge as the MP-18. It had a 30 round magazine and had a rate of fire of between 518 and 650 rounds per minute. And the French actually adopted this weapon. It was meant to be mass produced as the standard French submachine gun. The French believed that if a war broke out between Germany again in the 1920s and 30s, they would need a submachine gun just as the Germans had at the very end of World War I. And they expected the Germans to have a similar weapon to the MP-18 during this future conflict. But as the early 20s began to drag on, the French believed that there might not be a conflict between France and Germany. Keep in mind, Germany in the 1920s was going through an early version of the Great Depression. They had hyperinflation, their economy was on the verge of collapse, and they could barely fund any new military projects. So the French eventually abandoned this project, the MAS Model 1924, and by 1922-1923, only 1,000 of these submachine guns had actually been produced, and they stayed in French service until they were eventually phased out by the MAS 38 submachine gun. But imagine what could have happened if the French had mass produced this submachine gun in the 1920s when they had the chance. Keep in mind, in the 1920s and 30s, Germany was actually still producing the MP-18 as the MP-28, which was just a slight redesign of the MP-18. And by World War II, the Germans had produced tens of thousands of those submachine guns, combined with the other submachine guns they had, like the MP-40, the MP-38, and the other lesser-known submachine guns, like the Irma MP-34, the MP-35 submachine guns, and a bunch of other lesser-known submachine guns like the Hyman MP-32 submachine guns. So in total, the Germans had literally tens of thousands and the hundreds of thousands, actually, by the eve of World War II of submachine guns, and the French had less than 2,000 submachine guns. They had about 2,500 if you combine the STAs, but most of the STAs were in storage during the outbreak of World War II. But imagine if the French had mass-produced this weapon as their standard issued submachine gun. Imagine if they had at least, 200,000 of these, let's say, by the time of the battles of Norway, Belgium, and France in 1940. They might have fared better against the German stormtroopers and their submachine guns if they had a simple, cheap weapon like this STA Model 1922. But unfortunately, the French didn't have 20/20 vision and they could not see the future, and this weapon was abandoned early in 1922-1923. The next weapon on the list is actually a machine gun, a light machine gun. Now, during World War II, during the in battles of Belgium and France, and even the Battle of Norway, the French actually did have a decent light machine gun in the form of the FM Model 1929, the standard light machine gun of the French military, and that machine gun had replaced the old shot machine gun from the First World War. But that machine gun was magazine fed. It was fed by a 20-round box magazine. But believe it or not, the French had actually developed a even better light machine gun in the same year that the STA Model 1922 was abandoned. And that machine gun is number 3 on the list, the Darna Model 1922 light machine gun from 1922. And this was actually a French belt-fed light machine gun designed in 1922. It was chambered in 2 cartridges, the 8x50mm WWll, and there were newer versions chambered in the 7.5x54mm French cartridge, which was the round that replaced the old WWll cartridge. This weapon was fed by either a 100 to 250 round belts, or it could be fed by a 50 to 100 round drum magazine. And there was also a rare naval version that used a fusion of the drum and the belt system. So it was a drum magazine, but you could add additional belts to it as it was being fed, as it was being fired. Now, this weapon was never mass produced anywhere near as much as the STA submachine gun. Only about 700 of these were ever produced in total, and it was actually a pretty good weapon. In fact, one of the biggest problems the French had is that they had no belt-fed weapons during their time in World War II in 1940. The standard French gun was still the old Hotchkiss M1914 and the WWll series of light machine guns, of pan-fed light machine guns from 1931 to 1934. Now, the Hotchkiss used metallic strips, which were good enough in World War I, but by World War II, the Germans were using belt-fed machine guns like the MG34. Even the British had a problem with this, as most of their machine guns were also either magazine-fed or were pan-fed machine guns, meaning they used either a box magazine or a circular pan, which doesn't sound all that bad, but when your enemies have belt-fed machine guns and they're literally putting hundreds of thousands of rounds down range, in the span of just a few hours, a magazine-fed light machine gun and a metallic strip-fed heavy machine gun really isn't cutting it when compared to what your enemy is using. And the French actually had a good weapon in the Darna, but unfortunately this weapon was never taken seriously, and only 700 were produced. Half of those were sold to other countries, like for example Yugoslavia also purchased some of these machine guns in the 1930s. The rest of these machine guns were modified and given to the French Navy, where they were used as close-range anti-aircraft weapons on board French warships. The French Army only had about 100 to 150 of these light machine guns still in service on land in 1940 during the German invasion. But imagine if this weapon had been mass-produced just as much as the other French machine guns. For example, imagine if this weapon had become the standard LMG. Imagine if this had replaced the old Hotchkiss machine gun from 1914, or the old Hotchkiss Model 1909, which was also still in service, or the Shoshat. Believe it or not, the old Shoshat LMG was still in service during the Second World War with some French units. So this weapon, the Darna M1922, was a wasted opportunity. But like I said at the beginning of the video, the French didn't have 20/20 hindsight, so they didn't think they would actually have to fight another war with Germany, at least not until the later 30s, when Germany annexed Czechoslovakia and later Austria, when it became clear that war was eventually coming. But by that point, it was too late, and weapons like the Darna just weren't mass-produced enough to make any difference on the battlefield. And that leads us to the number 2 weapon on the list, the most effective, or at least one of the most powerful French anti-tank guns of the war between Germany and France, and that is number 2, the Cannon D 75mm Model 1897-1933-1938. And these are actually 2 versions of the same gun. These were the French Model 1933 and Model 1938 anti-tank guns. Now, in the early 1930s, the French had a large number of leftover 75 millimeter Model 1897 field guns, and many of these were rebuilt into either anti-aircraft weapons or anti-tank guns. And the Model 1933 through 1938 is one of those examples. It was a cheap, easy to mass produce anti-tank gun that used the same ammunition and some newer armor-piercing and anti-aircraft ammunition from the old Model 1897 gun that had been in service since before World War I. So the French had modified about 700 of those Model 1897 guns into these anti-tank guns. And these guns could penetrate between 66 and 90 millimeters of armor. So this gun was pretty much an overkill to most German tanks. Now remember, one of the reasons why France fell in 1940 was they lacked anti-tank guns. They had anti-tank guns. They had their standard anti-tank gun, the APX 47mm Model 1937 anti-tank gun, and they also had the 25mm Hotchkiss anti-tank gun, and they also had a bunch of other lesser-known anti-tank guns like the Mac and a few anti-aircraft guns that were rebuilt into anti-tank guns, but those were not mass-produced in any large numbers. In fact, the most common anti-tank gun was still the old Model 1916 37mm anti-tank gun that was developed in World War I, and that was actually an infantry support gun that was reallocated to anti-tank use during the Battle of France in 1940 and also during the Battle of Belgium. The Belgian army also used some of those old guns as cheap anti-tank weapons. But the problem is those weapons, with the exception of the APX 47mm and the 25mm Hotchkiss, most of the other guns were either not good enough to destroy most German tanks, or there were nowhere near enough numbers. But the French actually had a chance to mass produce this weapon. This weapon, the Model 1933-1938, was just a conversion of an existing artillery piece, the Cannon de Model 1897 field gun. But unfortunately, the French didn't take this weapon system seriously either, and instead they continued to tinker with other anti-tank weapons. Remember, the 25mm Hotchkiss was actually a good gun. It could defeat most German tanks, but there was simply not enough of them. The same with the 47mm gun. It was just not enough. But the French had thousands of Cannon Model 1897s that could have been easily converted into these anti-tank guns. But that never happened, and only 700 of these guns were produced. They were good enough guns, and they also doubled as anti-aircraft and anti-infantry weapons, as they could use the same canister rounds as the old 1897 and some of the newer anti-aircraft shells used in the other modifications of the 1897 gun into an anti-aircraft platform. So this weapon could have been an end-all be-all to both the German panzer units and the Luftwaffe, but ultimately this never happened, and this weapon was never mass-produced beyond the 700 conversions that took place in the mid-1930s. And number one, the number one most useful weapon that the French had that could have been very useful if it had been mass-produced before the years 1939 through 1940. The weapon that was just as good, it wasn't as powerful, but was just as good as the German 88mm flak. The weapon that could have been the MVP for the French army on the ground, both in Norway, Belgium, and even at the Maginot Line. The weapon that could have been the greatest French weapon, but not many were produced, and that is number one, the Cannon, the CA 75mm Model 1932 Schneider, also known as the Schneider Model 1932, and this was a dual-purpose anti-aircraft, anti-infantry support gun, or infantry support gun, that was produced from 1932 until about 1934 before it was replaced with even simpler weapons, but those weapons simply weren't as good as this gun, at least not until 1939, that is. Now, the Cannon CA 75mm Model 1932 Schneider was an anti-aircraft cannon designed in 1932. It was chambered for the more powerful 75 by 518mm rim cartridge. And there were multiple versions of ammunition for this weapon. You had the anti-aircraft version, the anti-aircraft shells, you had anti-infantry shells or high explosive shells, and these shells could also penetrate through any German tank in 1940. There was no German tank that was strong enough to withstand a round from this gun. This gun could penetrate upwards to 100 millimeters of armor at about 1,000 yards, so almost as good as the German 88 millimeter flak. The problem is, this gun was nowhere near mass-produced to be effective in 1940. This gun also had a range, a ceiling of 27,000 feet, meaning it could shoot down almost any Luftwaffe aircraft, any of Germany's fighters, bombers, or reconnaissance aircraft that could have been victims to this gun. Keep in mind, the French actually had a large number of anti-aircraft guns, but most of them were just rebuilt Model 1897 field guns that were given slightly longer barrels or newer chassis. But this gun here was a complete redesign of the Model 1897 into a much more powerful gun using a much larger cartridge. This gun also had a pretty high rate of fire for a gun of this size, having a rate of fire of between 15 and 25 rounds per minute, but some soldiers could do upwards to 30 rounds per minute, so just as fast as the German 88 millimeter flak. But like I said, this weapon was not mass produced in any large numbers. Only 192 of these guns were ever produced, and this was actually the most effective French anti-aircraft weapon. It was a good gun. The French soldiers, these guns were mostly stationed in major French cities, and they were used to shoot down Luftwaffe aircraft that tried to bomb those targets during the war. They tried to bomb some of the more civilian populated targets during the war between Germany and France. But imagine if the French had actually mass-produced this anti-aircraft system like they did with their smaller guns. Keep in mind, the French had a lot of smaller AA guns, like the Hotchkiss Model 1929, the 13.2 millimeter anti-aircraft autocannon. They also had the Hotchkiss Model 1934, the 24 millimeter, the 25 millimeter anti-aircraft autocannon, and a bunch of 37 millimeter anti-aircraft autocannons. Those were all good weapons, but they were all short-range weapons. They could not hit some of the higher targets, like the German heavy bombers, or some of the German dive bombers, like the Stuka. And they definitely couldn't hit most of the higher altitude fighter aircraft that the Germans had. But this weapon could shoot down most of those aircraft. But unfortunately, this weapon was never mass produced. Just imagine what the French could have done at the Maginot Line. Imagine if the French had these at the Maginot Line instead of those older anti-aircraft guns or those smaller calibered anti-aircraft guns. Imagine these guns just destroying hordes of German tanks. One round from this could obliterate any Panzer 1, 2, 3, or 4. Any of those earlier model Panzer tanks could have been knocked out with this with one shot. This was the French equivalent to the 88 millimeter flak, in terms of its usefulness. And just like the 88 millimeter flak, this gun was pretty mobile, It was pretty easy to set up. It wasn't difficult to use this gun. But unfortunately, the French didn't mass produce this weapon, and this weapon project was largely abandoned. The guns that were produced were used. Ultimately, the French would come up with better systems. This wasn't like the best they had in 1940. They had other guns like the Cannon Model 1939 and the Model 1940, which used even more powerful cartridges. But just like this gun, it wasn't mass produced. But this weapon actually had nearly a decade. The French actually had roughly a decade to mass produce this weapon. Imagine if France had about 5,000 or 6,000 of these. In 1940, these would have been so useful in 1940 if the French had had about 4,000 to 5,000 of these ready by the time of the German invasion of Norway, Belgium, and France in 1940. But that's it. These were the 5 French weapons that were badly needed in 1940. Unfortunately, these weapons were never mass produced. But what are your opinions on these weapons? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.